is Chapter 11, Imperfect Competition. There's really two kinds of imperfect competition. One is oligopolies and one is monopolistic competition, although this chapter is mostly about oligopolies. Oligopolies means a few firms. What does a few firms mean? Few firms means that each firm takes the behavior of the other firms into account when making its price and output decisions. What that means is that when we think about market equilibrium, we're going to have a more complex definition. Our definition of market equilibrium previously has been that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. In addition to that criteria, we're now going to say each firm is happy with its price and output. No firm wants to change what it's doing. So that'll be our broader definition of equilibrium. When you study oligopolies, we worry about what's called applied welfare economics. And what that means is whether the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus is as large in oligopoly as it would have been in some other form. So I'll say perfect competition. So we're always going to be thinking about deadweight losses when we're using these models to try to predict behavior. Now, just like when we did perfect competition, well, maybe not just like, in a more complex way, product differentiation is now going to be very important. Do all the firms make the exact same thing, or do firms make different things? So, for example, a natural oligopoly to study is OPEC, because it's a cartel. Now, if you know a lot about oil markets, you know that not all oil is created equal. But most people assume that it is, and when they publish Brent crude prices or West Texas Intermediate prices, they're thinking that oil is the same. Table 11.1 shows a typical way people start thinking about oligopolies. So this is now assuming there's only two firms, and they're talking about, this is a very simplified model, and we know what that means, right? There's a lot of assumptions underlying it. These firms only have two choices, to advertise or not. And they compare the two firms, and then they construct in Table 11.1 a payoff matrix. So this is very elementary game theory. And they talk about, first you have to calculate what the returns are to each of the strategies. But your returns depend on the activity of the other firm. And that's what we mean by the firms have to take each other into account when they're making their decisions. A straightforward model to study when you do oligopolies is a cartel. So this is when there's several firms, but they all act together. And OPEC is a perfectly interesting cartel to study. Figure 11.1 talks about why cartels might be unstable. It's interesting to apply that model to OPEC, where there's some famous predictions by Nobel laureates that were wrong about stability. A variant of a cartel is collusion. Collusion is not quite as strong as a cartel. The firms don't act exactly as a monopolist. One of the reasons that collusion is interesting, and the book doesn't talk much about the legal environment in the United States, but our antitrust laws are sort of interesting. Because what they say is if there's two firms in an industry and they both have the same price, then they must be colluding. And then the law goes on to say if one firm has a lower price than the other firm, it must be doing what's called predatory pricing. That means it's trying to drive the other firm out of business. And so therefore that's illegal. And then the third part of the law says if one firm has a price above the other firms, that means that firm must already have some monopoly power. And so that's illegal. So firms in an oligopoly always have large legal departments because they're having to deal with this legislation that says if your price is the same, higher or lower than the other firm, it's illegal. There's another interesting example of a cartel. Then the book talks about very simple game theoretic structures, I guess I'll say. So the first one it talks about is Patron Competition, which says that the firms react to each other by setting the price. So this is could be implicit collusion, can't be explicit collusion because that's what's illegal by the antitrust laws I just said. And the book introduces Nash equilibrium, which is that second leg of equilibrium that I discussed, which is that no firm wants to change its price and output decisions when you're thinking about whether a market is equilibrium. A more common model than the Patron is the Cournot Model, which is what's next discussed in the book. All these simple models are really, they start from a demand curve, They say that the demand for firm 1 depends on what firm 2 does, and then tries to calculate, essentially that gives you a downward sloping demand curve for each firm, which means you have to think about what marginal revenue is. And so the book talks about how to do that. Figure 11.3 is an interesting example because it shows sort of the net demand curve and then a marginal revenue curve taken from that. And then figure 11.4 graphically presents an equilibrium in the market by forming what are called reaction curves. So reaction curves is how does firm 1's optimal output change when firm 2 changes its behavior and vice versa. And so this is a cool graph that uses, like I said, very simple game theory to get to an equilibrium. It's natural to compare these different equilibriums with these different assumptions about the game theoretic structure, Patron, Cournot, compare it to perfect collusion, and compare it to competition. Section 11.5 introduces Stackelberg model, which says that the first firm to move, now you might think of that as invent the product, somehow it's a price leader or like that, has an advantage. These models can get complex in a hurry. And then the book starts to talk about differentiated good. What happens if the firms don't make the exact same thing? And most of the oligopolies we're used to thinking about, like on the retail side, definitely have product differentiation. And again, they sort of talk about what the net demand curves are and calculating marginal revenue from that. And it leads naturally into talking about monopolistic competition. That's a simple model that makes the assumption that every firm has a downward sloping demand curve because their product's a little different. It could be different just by location or by time, or it could have different attributes. When you think about something as complex as a car, clearly there's lots of different attributes of the car, and no two firms make the exact same vehicle. The monopolistic competition model is an advantage because you can graph more what's going on. This chapter really invites creativity with graphs. There's a lot more things you can do than what's here. What's cool about the monopolistic competition model is you can actually get to a long-run equilibrium, which they do in figure 11.8. And so that's, in some sense, more satisfying than the earlier models that maybe don't do that quite as neatly. But of course, one of the troubles with simple models is they might not be right. And so that's why the earlier models are introduced.